Good day, everyone. On behalf of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, North America, or CILTNA, welcome to today's webinar, Creating Strategic Value Through Sustainability. This is the first in a series of webinars and events hosted by CILTNA, dedicated to the sustainability of our logistics and transport systems. We're happy you've decided to join us today and hope you will see value in this and future CILTNA webinars. I'm Eugene Hoeven, and I'll be moderator for today's session. Just a brief word on CILTNA. The Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport is the leading professional body for those who work or have an interest in logistics, transport, and supply chains. Founded in 1919 with over 34,000 members today in over 30 countries. CILTNA is North American branch. Our aim is to develop the art and science of transport and logistics through education, research, networking, and information sharing. If you or any other members of your teams are interested in learning more about the benefits of becoming a chartered or an accredited professional member of our institute, please visit ciltna.com. So as a background to today's webinar, climate change, the pandemic, cyber threats and attacks, new regulations, societal shifts, and geopolitical conflict have all conspired in recent times to challenge the sustainability of our supply chains. Companies operating in this field increasingly face environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, issues that can carry significant reputational and operational risks. The context is, in fact, circular in that ESG issues impose risks and costs on companies in the supply chain, while at the same time, a company can impose costs on the environment and society, which has implications for governance. Therefore, our awareness and mitigation of these risks can not only improve the resilience of our transport and logistics systems, but it is also key to sustainability and creating value for all stakeholders. Today's webinar is sponsored by CN, Canada's largest railway, based here in Montreal, with a network spanning Canada from coast to coast, as well as the Midwestern and Southern United States. And we are indeed fortunate to have as our first speaker, Ms. Janet Drysdale, Vice President, Financial Planning and Sustainability at CN. In this role, Janet oversees all financial planning and analysis activities, including CN's operating and capital budgets, revenue planning and forecasting, costing and profitability analysis, and economic regulation. This also includes driving CN's integrated sustainability strategy and overseeing the company's ESG disclosures and climate action plan. And I always say energy and transport are joined at the hip. And by this, I mean that without the two working together, we couldn't have transport and logistics functioning. So as a second speaker, we are equally fortunate to have Geoffrey Tauvette, Executive Director of the Canadian Council for Sustainable Aviation Fuels, or C-SAF. Jeff is a commercial aviation and engineering professional with more than 25 years of experience integrating aviation fuel procurement, environment, and climate risk management, which gives him a unique perspective on the creation of a sustainable aviation fuel market in Canada that will support decarbonization and sustainability of the aviation industry. The full speaker biographies can be found on the promotion page of this webinar. Janet and Jeff, welcome to you both. And as a technical matter for the audience, your microphones have been placed on mute and the chat feature is deactivated. If you have any questions or comments, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom, and I'll do my best to relay these to Jeff and Janet toward the end of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded. In due course, a link to the recording and presentations will be emailed to all participants. It will also be made available on CILTNA's social media feeds. Immediately following the webinar, we will distribute a brief survey to all participants via email. We urge you to take a few moments to complete it, which will help us to enhance our webinars going forward. And now, without further ado, Janet, I turn it over to you. Please remember to say, next slide, that our technician will advance the slides for you, and you have 20 minutes. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Eugene. Thank you to the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport for arranging today's really timely discussion. And especially thank you to all of you that are joining us today. Hopefully those of you in the Eastern time zone are able to enjoy a bite of lunch while you're listening in. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to share a bit of CN's sustainability story with you today. If you could please advance to slide 3. My objective this morning is just to provide a little bit of context on sustainability, how it's shaping our world. I'll provide you some background on CN, the environmental benefits of shipping by rail, and CN's efforts to further reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I also want to take a minute at the end and highlight a couple of CN's other key sustainability initiatives. Next slide, please. For the purposes of today's discussion, I'm going to use sustainability and ESG, which is short for environment, social governance, interchangeably. My key message here is very simple. The tipping point has happened. ESG has moved from niche to mainstream to mandatory. When we look back at 2021, we see a year that was marked by fires, floods, hurricanes, and temperatures that really tested the extremes of hot and cold. It was also the second most costly year on record for the world's insurers. Here in Canada, the cost of last year's severe flooding in British Columbia is estimated to be in the range of $10 billion. That makes it Canada's most costly natural disaster to date. And when the International Monetary Fund tallies up the cost to the global economy of COVID-19 pandemic, they arrive at a figure in excess of $12 trillion. Wall Street, led by titans like BlackRock's Larry Fink, have made it really clear that climate risk is investment risk. And when we look at COVID-19 or Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, and truth and reconciliation, these issues have thrust social issues into the forefront of business. According to Bloomberg, ESG assets are on track to exceed $50 trillion by 2025, which would represent more than a third of total global assets under management. Global green, social sustainability, and sustainability-linked bonds from corporations and governments actually surpassed $1 trillion for the first time in 2021. So what does that mean? It means that big money is interested in climate change. So as investors are integrating ESG into their fundamental company analysis, and as we see lenders integrating ESG as part of their risk assessments, companies need to move quickly to integrate and embed ESG into their business strategy and processes. But this is as much about being good as it is about doing good. Companies are more likely to create greater financial value if they create value for their own employees, their customers, their suppliers, and broader society. Running a successful business depends on healthy people and a healthy planet. I'm going to say a few words now about CN. If you could go to the next slide, please. So you can't do a rail presentation without a map. That's because in railroading, geography matters, and CN has great geography. Our nearly 20,000 route miles of network span Canada and Mid-America, connecting Atlantic, Pacific, and Gulf coasts. We have really great diversity as well when it comes to not only the geography, but commodities and customers that we serve. And we're very proud of the role that we're playing in supporting the transition to a lower carbon economy, whether that's bringing electric vehicles to market, moving scrap steel for reuse and recycling, or even facilitating what we expect is going to be really significant growth in the renewables fuels market. And I know there'll be more to say on that topic later today. So we take this great franchise and we combine it with a clear vision. Next slide, please. At CN, we aim to deliver sustainable growth for our customers, our people, our shareholders, and the communities in which we operate. Next slide, please. So if we think about our network as our what, then sustainability is a key part of our how. And at CN, delivering responsibly encapsulates how we conduct our business every day and our contribution to building a more sustainable future. We anchor ourselves on 5 pillars: environment, safety, people, community, and governance. So to put it simply, our focus is on moving our customers' goods safely and efficiently, doing so with minimal impact on the environment, attracting, developing, and retaining top diverse talent, and helping to build safer, stronger communities. Of course, all the while adhering to the highest ethical standards. You can see little boxes on the bottom here. Some of you may be familiar with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs, also known as the Global Goals, were adopted by the UN in 2015, really as a universal call to action to improve the health of people and planet. Fulfilling these ambitious goals will require an unprecedented effort by all of society, including business. CN supports all of the global goals, but we focus on the ones where we believe we can have the most impact, including climate action, building resilient infrastructure, promoting and enabling sustainable economic growth, and gender equality. So why do we care about the SDGs as a publicly traded company? Well, the SDGs facilitate the alignment of our corporate strategy with the needs of society. More specifically, they can be really helpful in highlighting areas of innovation and potential new markets. For CN, sustainability is really about meeting the needs of the present without compromising our future. It's about being deliberate in our strategy and the execution of our strategy to balance the short and the longer term. We're really proud of our track record, particularly the many firsts that we've had along the way, including being the first North American railroad to issue a sustainability report aligned with the Global Reporting Initiative, the first North American railroad and amongst the first 100 companies globally to set an approved science-based climate target, and the first North American railroad to secure a sustainability-linked loan. We were also amongst the first companies globally to provide our shareholders an advisory vote on our climate action plan. I do want to stress that sustainability is a journey. It's a journey we've been on at CN for well over a decade, and our success has been enabled really by a data-driven approach and leveraging global best-in-class frameworks. I really feel like these firsts have given us a head start, but we're cognizant that the momentum is accelerating and others are quickly catching up, which is great. We'll use that momentum to keep pushing further and faster. Next slide, please. On average, trains are about 4 times more fuel efficient than long-haul trucks. So moving long-haul freight by rail instead of trucks reduces GHG emissions by up to 75%. A single freight train can take over 300 trucks off the nation's highways. In the US, railroads account for about 40% of freight movements, but only 2% of transport-related GHG emissions. In Canada, railways move about 70% of the country's intercity freight while producing just 3.5% of Canada's transport-related GHG emissions. Rail today, right now, is part of the climate solution. I think even more importantly than that, every single Class 1 railway in North America has committed to a science-based climate target. In my view, that level of early and deep commitment by the North American rail sector will help all of us ensure that rail remains a key part of the climate solution for many more years. As an industry, I really feel we have a lot to be proud of. Next slide, please. At CN, we are moving more of our customers' goods with less carbon. CN leads the North American rail industry, consuming about 15% less locomotive fuel per gross ton mile than the average of our Class 1 peers. We've improved our locomotive emission intensity by 43% since 1993. This really strong track record of fuel and carbon efficiency has enabled us to decouple our growth from our carbon emissions intensity. The best opportunity for rail to participate in decarbonization is to convert more long-haul trucking to rail. Now, I fully recognize that GHG emissions are just one factor that shippers are assessing. We fully recognize that to attract a growing share of our customers' freight, service, ease of doing business, the cost competitiveness of the end-to-end supply chain are all still table stakes. But the transition to a lower carbon future means that GHG emissions are going to increasingly factor into our shippers' decision making. Next slide, please. So, given that about 85 to almost 90% of our GHG emissions come from the operation of our locomotive fleet, we continue to prioritize locomotive fuel efficiency in our emission reduction efforts. Unfortunately, in that regard, there's no silver bullet. Our silver bucket approach includes 5 key levers that we believe will be key to helping us achieve our 2030 target. They are investing in upgrading our locomotive fleet, increasing our use of fuel-efficient technologies, leveraging big data from our locomotive telemetry systems, improving operating practices, including idling reduction and engaging all of our employees in this journey. And the other lever that's emerging that we see as being critically important over the next 5 to 10 years is the increased use of sustainable renewable fuels. And in this regard, railways are more similar to the aviation industry than the trucking industry. And we're going to hear more about sustainable aviation fuel later, but I want to stress that we're well aligned in terms of that being a key lever for the rail industry as well. Last year, we announced an important partnership in the context of renewable fuels. CN and Progress Rail are working with Chevron Renewable Energy Group to test high-level renewable fuel blends, including both biodiesel and renewable diesel. And we believe this program is going to allow us to better understand the long-term durability of our locomotives that are using renewable fuel, and especially how they operate in cold weather. This would give us insights into about how we need to plan any required modifications to the fleet in order to fully leverage the use of renewable fuels over the next decade. The trials and qualifications we're doing will be including up to 100% bio-based diesel. And we feel this is really an important step in reducing GHG emissions from our existing locomotive fleet, while alternative propulsion locomotive technologies are being developed. Next slide, please. Okay, so as we think about the pathway to net zero 2050, innovation, technology, collaboration are all going to be really critical. CN is very pleased to have recently announced its purchase of Wabtec's FlexDrive battery electric locomotive for use on our Bessemer and Lake Erie line, making it the first 100% battery heavy haul locomotive for the region. And when used in a consist operation, the FlexDrive can reduce, we believe, overall fuel consumption and emissions by up to 30%. So some pretty significant benefits there. These anticipated efficiencies and emissions reductions, we think, are going to open the door to the wider deployment of new alternatives beyond the diesel-powered locomotives used today. We've also entered into a partnership with the Lion Electric Company to acquire 50 zero-emission trucks. These trucks are going to be used around our intermodal terminals to help reduce GHG and other emissions. And we're planning to test them in a variety of situations across the CN network, from urban delivery to container shuttle service to port operations. I mentioned earlier that every Class 1 North American railroad had committed to a science-based target. I want to reiterate again the uniqueness of that level of industry alignment and the important market signaling that it provides. The North American rail industry is sending a loud and clear signal to suppliers, governments, clean tech, and other stakeholders about the need to, one, increase the availability and cost competitiveness of renewable fuels, and two, the need to develop the locomotive of the future. I really want to applaud the efforts of all the Class 1 railways and short lines who are working to advance the industry's knowledge base when it comes to the use of renewable fuels, as well as those who are working to advance alternative propulsion technologies. As I said earlier, there's no silver bullet. I think to remain competitive in the decades ahead, the rail industry is going to have to embrace an unprecedented level of collaboration and innovation. And my personal view is that our industry's ultimate solution will likely include renewable fuels, battery electric, hydrogen, and potentially even the targeted deployment of catenary electric. So I'm going to pivot now quickly, and I want to talk just a little bit about the S, some of the social elements of ESG. Next slide, please. So railroading is a 24/7, 365 outdoor sport that involves people and heavy moving equipment. Railroad operations are unforgiving. It is a business where safety must be everyone's first priority every minute of every single day. At CN, we truly have an uncompromising commitment to the health and safety of our employees, the customers that we serve, and the communities and environments in which we operate. And that commitment is supported by 3 pillars: leadership, training, and technology. And underpinning our commitment and our pillars is our safety culture. Our ultimate goal is 0 serious injuries and fatalities, and to be the safest railway in North America. To achieve that, we're intensely focused on evolving from what I would call a compliance-driven safety culture to a values-based safety culture. And we're continuing to put safety really at the center of our day-to-day operations and all of our employee engagements, whether it's a job safety briefing, an exposure reduction discussion, or ensuring our employees' compliance with life-critical rules. I know we could spend hours on the topic of safety alone, but before I move on, I just wanted to draw your attention to the photo, which is actually the High Bay area of our training center in Winnipeg. If you look closely, you'll see our most recent addition to the center, which is our slip simulator. One of the leading causes of railway injuries are slips, trips, and falls. Walking. This new simulator is really a hands-on, practical, and effective way to help teach our employees how to reduce slip and fall accidents. I've been on it. It also is a way to help our employees think about how to engage their slow brain. And if you've spent time thinking about safety, you probably heard about fast brain versus slow brain. Being really present in the moment, aware of your surroundings, and aware of how you are best able to reduce your exposures. It's also just, I think, a really great way, a great example of how we're leveraging innovation and technology to create a safer work environment. Next slide, please. Okay, quickly, I want to touch on one additional social topic. Key priority for CN is to have a workforce that reflects the diversity of the communities in which we operate. The transportation industry broadly, and more specifically railroading, has always been a male-dominated industry. And while CN performs pretty well in the context of female representation, in the context of our peers, our total workforce has less than 10% women overall. So we're really far from where we need to be. You know, there's been a lot of talk about kind of the state of employment and how difficult it is to find employees. Recent survey I read talked about 9 out of 10 employers in the US indicating that they felt recruiting and hiring in 2022 will be either somewhat or very challenging. 8 out of 10 also indicated that employee retention would be somewhat or very challenging. And 2/3 of employers indicated they're aiming to grow their workforce. So those numbers just don't add up, and they certainly don't add up if you're only attracting 50% of the population into your candidate pool. So as an industry, we need to figure out how to attract and retain a more diverse workforce. So we've got a number of initiatives we're working on at CN that we hope is going to help us move the needle, including updating hiring practices, building diverse candidate pools, leveraging our employee resource groups. But we can and we must do better at CN and across the industry. I think if we want to attract the best of the next generation, one thing we need to do better is really do a better job of conveying our purpose. CN's a backbone of the economy. We're an enabler of trade. We're part of the climate solution. And we're embracing innovation and technology to enhance safety, drive efficiency, and sustain our business for the next 100 years. So when you put that together, it's a great time to be a railroader. Next slide, please. And so with that bright future in mind, a commitment to continuous improvement is really critical. We all know that what gets measured gets managed. So this page highlights some of our key ESG targets. I want to be clear, these aren't the targets of myself or my team. They are the targets of the entire CN organization from the front line to the boardroom. Next slide, please. But target setting alone is not enough. I think it's really important that we track performance and we have transparent disclosure. These are fundamental to driving success, and it's also part of the critical path to really embedding ESG into our strategy and our day-to-day business practices. You know, the primary users of this information historically have been investors, credit rating agencies, ESG rating agencies, but it's not just investors. Customers are now also collecting ESG information as part of their supplier evaluations, and certainly a growing number of customers are looking at their supply chains to see how they can reduce ESG risks and improve their own sustainability. You know, we're committed to continuously improving, and our sustainability reporting is an important part of that process. Being open about our business, communicating our progress with focus, clarity, and comparability. Let me wrap up on the next slide. So we have a really strong track record. We're very proud of our sustainability efforts, and we're fully committed to continue to improve. Rail has a tremendous potential to reduce the environmental impact of transportation. So as a mover of the economy, CN is committed to playing a key role in the transition to a lower carbon future.
Janet, it's a great presentation. You really set the scene, and it's amazing how similar the issues are with the mode that I'm most familiar with, which is aviation and air transport. Same issues are playing here. And I guess on everyone's mind these days, and first question for you would be, when we talk about biofuels and sustainable aviation fuels for that matter as well, do you have any concern about supply, and how is that ramping up?
Many concerns, many concerns. So biofuels indeed play a significant role in our decarbonization roadmap going forward. You know, a portion of our increased usage will be driven by regulations, such as the Canadian Clean Fuel Standards. However, we know that we're going to need to blend above those regulations. So our procurement team is working closely with fuel suppliers, with current suppliers, with new suppliers to understand, how future availability and costs are evolving. We're in a unique position in a way because in addition to being a consumer, we're also a transporter. So we have some good visibility on the market, and certainly we're looking for any and all opportunities to secure additional volumes, through offtake agreements, for example. But yes, I think it's fair to say that this is something that we all need to be focused on, both in industry and in government. But I think Canada and the US are really well positioned to support, the growth of the renewable fuels market.
Yeah. Well, actually, we'll move right on just in the interest of time, because I think Jeff is going to have quite a bit to say on this, at least from the aviation perspective. Thank you, Janet. And now, Jeff, over to you. And again, don't forget to say next slide to advance. You have 20 minutes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Eugene. Thanks, Janet. Interesting to hear rail's similar challenges compared to aviation. Today, what I hope to do is I'm representing the Canadian Council for Sustainable Aviation Fuels. So we're a piece and a big piece of aviation's sustainability plan for reducing emissions. So I'm not going to talk about the S or the G of the ESG, the sustainability part, but definitely this is related to environment. So next slide, Jackie, please. Well, first, what I wanted to do is just take you a bit, just to put in context what aviation is doing for decarbonization. Next slide. And before, so we'll go over this, and then we'll go into what we're doing around sustainable aviation fuel. So what we have, aviation is probably one of the first global industries to come together probably about a decade ago and came up with a climate action plan for the industry. It included targets around fuel efficiency. It included programs around capping emissions at in this case, 2019 levels. And you'll hear CORSIA from time to time mentioned by the industry. It is a program put in place by ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is a UN body, which was tasked with specifically looking at dealing with, it deals specifically with aviation, but in the case of environment and climate, it was tasked by the UN body looking at, the worldwide kind of climate issues, 1.5 degrees. ICAO was tasked to deal with aviation, similar to marine, which share some of our and rail's concerns around decarbonization. The International Maritime Organization as well is looking at that. But what's clear is industry has spent a lot of time, and in recent times have now committed to flying or producing net zero emissions by 2050. So this is an upgrade to the plan that was in place previously. And what's important here is the industry spent a lot of time looking at making sure that science could really sort of back the fact that we were trying to reach this commitment. And a lot of work has been done by industry, including all the various players in it, to establish and evaluate the various scenarios of getting to 2050. And while many scenarios were looked at, what's important, and you can see this on the pie graph on the right, is that there's a bucket of similar to rail again, but there's a bucket of 4 things that can be done to reduce emissions. Improve your operations, make sure you're using everything efficiently, investing in infrastructure to ensure that you can travel and taxi and use the airports in an efficient manner. New technologies such as propulsions, and we'll go over this in a second, and where they sit in the plan. But any way you look at it, we're going to need sustainable aviation fuels to help aviation decarbonize. And really, it is the largest percentage. We know it's deployable now, and we know we can have the biggest impact. So that's what we're working on. We'll go a little bit over why Canada and where it stands in terms of SAF, and why C-SAF was put in place in order to help this go forward. Next slide, Jackie. So why SAF again? If you look at the technology that we see coming into new propulsion systems for aviation, you saw an announcement today, I believe, from Air Canada in terms of purchasing some electric aircraft. So we know electric and hydrogen-celled aircraft are coming into the market. They'll be able to fulfill, I think, a shorter distance, a smaller number of people flying, but we're still really challenged with, unfortunately, the physics of flight. When we look at it, SAF is still fulfilling that need in helping us achieve those decarbonization. So look into the future, SAF still plays a huge role in helping aviation decarbonize. Next slide, please. So you might be asking yourselves, what is SAF? What is, we've chosen a term called sustainable aviation fuel. So what does that mean? So what it means is that it's a liquid fuel, it's drop-in. Drop-in means that it looks, it smells, it acts exactly like jet fuel. We don't have to replace engines. We don't have to replace any of the delivery equipment. So really it's a replacement fuel for conventional jet fuel, but it's made from lower carbon sources. So therefore the carbon intensity of the fuel is about 80% less. And what's important to remember here is that we're not, it's reducing the carbon intensity, but it's reusing and recycling carbon from sources. Next slide, please. Sources that we know we can make this SAF out of, and that includes biomass from woody residues, wood chips, municipal garbage, plant-based oils. Used oil for fries, for example, has been used and targeted on several occasions for making SAF. And all that is recycled carbon from the atmosphere. And therefore, we're not adding to the global concentrations of emissions by reusing some of the carbon that's already in the air. So that gives us the reduction in carbon. And why we want it sustainable? Well, aviation has also agreed that these fuels shouldn't compete with food security. We shouldn't be causing any impacts to the environment, and we want to enhance the sustainability of aviation by using these fuels. So that's a key piece that we need to understand, because there are certain criteria that these fuels need to adhere to count towards some of the programs and count towards how aviation is using them. Next slide, please. So where's Canada? Where's Canada? We know we have everything we need in Canada to be able to make these fuels. We have the right ingredients. We have like enviable, sustainable biomass materials, such as wood, such as plants, such as agricultural residue. We have a refining complex that is used to refining complex feedstocks, as I like to call it, great academia, great tech. So what's wrong? How come we haven't produced anything yet? Next slide. Well, one of the reasons is that we haven't had a plan. We haven't had an organization that's trying to bring everyone together. It's been a fragmented approach in terms of some of the approaches that have been taken. So this is why C-SAF has come into the market. It is, our goal is really to bring the ecosystem together. So this is a great opportunity to talk about value chain, and we'll go into a little bit about who the players are in a little bit. But really it's bring all the various players that are not normally part of the fuel value chain with an airline together, because we know they're different and there are more of them than what we see on a normal basis. And really our vision is to facilitate the production and use of fuels in Canada. We want those fuels for sustainable aviation fuels to be affordable. So how can we put in place programs to make sure that we get to scale, that these fuels are affordable, that we can use them, that they're sustainable? Of course, they need to meet the sustainability criteria. And we feel there's a great opportunity for Canada to make it and produce it here. And so while we're not restricting ourselves to using only made in Canada fuel, we would hope that the policy and environment that we put in place makes it so that we make the fuels here and we give an economic opportunity for Canada going forward. Next slide, please. So how did C-SAF come along? There's been initiatives in the past to look at bringing together folks to look at a pan-Canadian approach to developing SAF. The airlines saw an opportunity to help out in here. They realized that they're an important piece of the value chain, obviously, as the end user. And we have structures in place across the country where the airlines already work together to own and operate the fueling infrastructure at the major airports in Canada. We call these fuel consortia. And there's about 13 fuel consortia in Canada, where again, the airlines act as a group to make the delivery of fuel and the ownership of those assets affordable, and in the case of working together to ensure that we have effective fuel delivery systems at the airport. So these two units together, if you will, are super important, obviously, to the value chain of SAF, seeing as though it's the storage and handling piece, and of course the end users. The airlines also realize that they can't do this alone. These setups allow them to spread costs across the users of the fuel. So therefore, they are supporting C-SAF in our budget for moving forward. And then what we've done is we've reached out to the rest of the value chain that we know are needed in order to realize our objectives and mission. Those include the fuel refiners, the feedstock producers, the airports, the OEMs, the academia sector. We have banks, we have legal firms, for example, that are involved with some of our businesses. And really the hope here is that we nurture that ecosystem so that we can all work together in a common approach for putting SAF in place in Canada. So what are we talking about? Next slide, Jackie. So we're going to talk about the roadmap work in a bit here on where we're getting that. But what we've done is we've tried to set a target on what we thought was achievable within Canada, but it's still a stretch target. This graph represents jet fuel usage in Canada. So today there's about 10 billion liters that let's call it in a normal year, notwithstanding the COVID impact on travel, of course. But in a normal year, we were using every airline flying into Canada use about 10 billion liters of jet fuel. If we look out into 2025, there's some announcements from some suppliers and putting in place some renewable fuel refineries. We believe there's a little bit of SAF that could come out of that, about 500,000 liters in this case. So not a lot, but at least a start to creating this market. If we take the industry or the industry average of about 10% in 2030 of where we see countries targeting SAF production or use in Canada, that means we're trying to target 1 billion liters of SAF by 2030. And I want you to remember that number because that's going to be important as we talk about the roadmap. So 1 billion liter challenge. What do we need to get there, and how do we get there? And the interesting thing too, if we look up to 2050. And we use, if you recall the pie graph from earlier, SAF really is a big piece of our solution for decarbonizing. And if we follow the amount of SAF that we would actually need, we probably need about 7.5 to 8 billion liters of SAF in 2050 to achieve that 60% or 2050 sort of net zero. Now, in addition to SAF, by the way, SAF doesn't obviously get us completely to net zero. The aviation world is still looking at other solutions such as carbon removal, obviously different fuels, electric aircraft, and the hydrogen used to make these things. There is a type of fuel which I went over quickly called power to liquids, which uses carbon, which a green carbon from a source, and renewable energy to be able to produce green hydrogen. And those two combined together can make a very, very low carbon intense fuel. And really, you see this type of fuel coming into production probably in the next decade. And that is really something that we feel is going to advance the amount of fuels coming forward. But the key piece to this, though, is if you look at the 7.5 billion liters, that's about how much fuel we produce today in Canada. So really, we're talking about maybe displacing that fuel or adding to it, but it's a significant amount. We're basically taking the jet fuel business of today and saying, okay, we got to make this into 100% SAF. So that's a huge challenge that we're still talking to with everyone, but just to put in your minds of what we're trying to achieve. Next slide, please. So moving forward, next slide, Jackie. As I said earlier, the supply chain is different from our normal and conventional jet fuel. I've been to meetings as an airline when we were looking at how we were going to implement SAF. You're talking to farmers, you're talking to forestry folks because you want to understand where the feedstock is coming from. So the supply chain is way bigger than the conventional thing. And I think what we've seen and even some of the initial interactions we've had with C-SAF is there's still a lot of different understanding of what SAF is. And of course, each stakeholder has a different opportunity and challenge. And one of the benefits we've seen even in our recent interactions is getting folks around the table to understand what each other's challenges and opportunities are. And what's important to remember for an airline, of course, for fuel, is that it represents about 30% of the cost of an airline. Generally, this year is probably a little bit more. The airlines need it. They need the fuel at the airport to be able to fly. It's obviously the lifeblood of the aircraft to be able to do the business. So, you know, we depend on ratable supply to the airport. We need to ensure that it's there. But the big question, of course, is how do we reduce that cost of the SAF and work it into the airline's model of providing service moving forward. Next slide, please. One of the key things that we've missed that's missing in Canada, of course, is a roadmap for SAF. A lot of other countries you've seen are putting in place plans to show you know, what they're doing to prioritize some of the actions to bring SAF to their industry. So we've taken that. That was a gap that was missing in Canada. C-SAF has moved forward with a clean competitiveness SAF roadmap. We've engaged the membership in a few workshops to develop, you know, policy or priority activities that we feel are needed in order to advance SAF. The second workshop was interesting as well. As we see, we're trying to take a national approach, but it's very obvious that Canada has great and different opportunities across the different regions. So it was important for us to move down into those regions to identify potential value chains that could be created. And at the end of the day, we're aiming for a draft of this report to come out in the next few weeks. It really is putting in place the actions we feel are required to reach that 1 billion liters that I mentioned earlier. So what does it take? What will we need to do to be able to reach that in terms of feedstock, in terms of the technology that we might have to invest in terms of the priorities that we should be focused on, and really setting the stage for the next sort of piece of this work, which is how do we develop the policy to support the effort and the time to get to that 1 billion liters if we want to reach that 10% target. Next slide, please. Our roadmap, by the way, we're targeting for the end of November to produce, and then we're in the state of getting our membership to help us review it and finalize it and make sure we come out with it, including collaborating with the government as an important stakeholder in terms of us being able to put in place this roadmap as well. What we want to remember for SAF, again, it's important for the industry. It's one of our only solutions for it's one of the many solutions, but it really is the best and the most obvious solution at this point that we can deploy to help aviation decarbonize. I like to say that, you know, Canada has all the right ingredients. We need to make it, and to stay competitive for the industry in Canada to stay competitive, they need SAF. It also supports many other stakeholders that we see in Canada that are involved in aviation and aerospace. These include the OEMs and the huge manufacturing sector we have. They need time for the technology to catch up to the law of physics. Hydrogen-powered aircraft are still out in the future. It's being tested. Electric aircraft need to be tested and approved by the regulators. So there's some time required in order to put these solutions in place, but we know we can make SAF today. So we need the SAF to be able to decarbonize now. That gives obviously these aeronautics and aerospace manufacturers some time as well to develop the new technologies for propulsion. It's very costly still, so we need to find somehow some way of reducing that cost. So how can we limit that impact on aviation customers? You know, it's all related to the airfare, right? How much more are people prepared to pay in the airfare to be able to support these initiatives? Next slide, please. So SAF policy, as I say, or in the last slide, if you saw, is key. This is a new market. The clean competitiveness roadmap is looking at SAF as a system. So Canada has the right ingredients. It's going to be SAF is going to be piece of this growing renewable fuels market or renewable chemicals market that is developing. It's an economic opportunity for Canada. So what kind of policies are needed to be able to support the creation of this market? But what we are seeing, and what's important, is that we need a policy that's tailored for aviation. A lot of the low carbon policies are directed towards ground transport. We know that SAF is a little harder to make and a little bit more expensive to make than renewable diesel. But of course, it's much more visible and easier to understand to the clients. So we're looking to see whether or not we can leverage that ability. We are very concerned about other incentives in other countries. The Americans have recently passed some incentives that might make it, or we know is incenting SAF use down in the US, and we're worried that some of our Canadian feedstock and knowledge ends up down there, and we're left with nothing to be able to help us decarbonize. But what we are seeing is that we need to strike a balance between if we're talking about a demand mandate, there needs to be support on the supply side. We need some positive supply incentives to be able to make up the difference between the costlier fact that SAF is harder and more expensive to make. We need to realize that airlines are a captive market. We don't want to end up in a situation where we're forced with a demand quota to be able to have to use the fuel at any cost without any cost protection. So we need to realize that because we have no other options, it creates a situation where it's a little bit of an unfair market. And any policy and regulation that have to be put in place need to ensure that we have some transparency and we have a framework where we can mutually, the airlines and the supply community can work together to come up with a deal that makes sense. Next slide, please. And I'll finish with this. I just some final thoughts and stuff that I thought would be important for you to know. And I think Janet mentioned it a few times, like how are companies dealing with their scope 3 emissions and who's going to account for them. This is a growing sort of field where we're seeing some tensions between everyone. Corporate customers want to offset their scope 3 emissions. It's impacting obviously the carrier in terms of how they do that. Book and claim is becoming a thing for SAF especially. So this is a system that's been put in place. What we want to avoid obviously is a system where if we have limited amount, we're not spending time transporting that fuel at every single airport to be able to use it. So this book and claim is meant to address that, where you can buy the energy, the renewable credit associated with the fuel from a different location, but ensure that that fuel is produced similar to how renewable electricity somewhat works. So there are programs that are developing and burgeoning in that area. And then, of course, working together, similar to what we've seen here, is important. I think, looking how we can optimize, and I'm thinking about your businesses, the logistics, how the airports ensure that they have access to greener ways of transporting the cargo that arrives by air, for example. And of course, there are opportunities on the ground for electrified equipment or hydrogen powered equipment and so on and so forth. So definitely, how do we work together to ensure that those discussions continue? But one of the important things I think I can leave you with, of course, if you have or your customers have SAF demand, I think it's important that you let either your preferred airline or the airlines know, or myself or our organization, because that helps any type of demand requirement that we're seeing from the corporate world in terms of creating a demand profile is important and helpful. It's helpful for us when we structure our policy discussions with the government that we know are going to come forward, because it gives us a better avenue of saying, yes, in addition to the airlines wanting this, we're hearing this request from the customers as well. And I'll leave you with that today, and look forward to questions. And thank you for allowing me the time to chat today.
Jeff, great presentation, and yeah, there are a lot of complexities and challenges to SAF production and getting it to the aircraft, if you will, at the end of the day. The demand is there; it's quite clear. I think the one big issue is, of course, the price and the availability, and what policy changes need to be made specifically in terms of tax credits, mandates, etc. You touched on some of them, but what specifically in the Canadian context would be a recommendation for you to bring us on a course to achieving price parity with the Jet A1 fuel, which is now in common use, of course, in aviation?
Yeah, I mean, I use the term affordable because we're never quite sure if it will ever get to parity, but certainly it's a cost that needs to be worked into the model. When we look at the policy environments, North America is really based on an incentive-based policy market. So therefore, we need to ensure that Canada's system accounts for that. So I mentioned we need some supply incentives. So typically, because SAF is more expensive to make than some of the other renewable fuels, somehow the policy needs to recognize that cost difference and help make that decision to make the product easier. Other modes, of course, have different opportunities to change their propulsion systems quicker. So we're wondering if the policy environment can be structured to support aviation, but also incent the other modes to transition more quickly. For example, long distance transport, we know is looking at hydrogen, and maybe that's an area, if they could reduce their renewable fuel use, it could be transferred for use into aviation, for example. So how do we structure potentially a policy that helps that along?
Right. At this point, I'd like to, just in the interest of time, open it up to all. I guess I have one question here from the audience for Geoffrey. What about public passenger acceptance once they are fully aware of the type of fuel propelling the aircraft? I guess you kind of spoke about book and claim, but yeah.
If I'm to hear that, and I might have jumped over it fairly quickly. SAF is also safe. We value safety as well compared to everyone, and it goes through extensive testing, and it needs to meet worldwide approved criteria. This fuel is safe. It's exactly like jet fuel, and there's no more testing of the SAF anymore. It's actually being used today in several airports across the world. So it's as safe as jet fuel, and I think we haven't seen any customer backlash about it. I think our challenge is explaining what it is in a more simpler way, but definitely I think there's some compelling reasons to use it.
Yeah, there's a lot of science and chemistry behind it, which gets confusing for many. There's another question I have for Janet. A modal shift from trucking to rail has long been a worthwhile target, but governments have been loath to put muscle behind it. Do you foresee a business design where shippers own the carbon footprint of the carriers they select, and that will drive the modal shift?
Yeah, I don't know that they'll own the carbon footprint necessarily, but we have to remember, we're not alone in the transport sector in terms of setting climate-based science targets. Our customers are doing the same. And for most of our customers, the bulk of their GHG emissions are going to come from scope 3, which is actually their supply chain. So as we, CN and the rails, reduce our scope 1 emissions, we're actually by definition helping our customers reduce their scope 3. So customers are increasingly going to drive this agenda. But I think it's important also to kind of stress the policy impact that Jeff has talked a little bit about. The same is true here, right? And I would say, under the cap and trade program we've had in Quebec, for example, we've had some really good success with some of those cap and trade dollars being reinvested, where some of our customers, for example, have been able to get access to funds to put rail into their facility. That's an important piece, and it's a really good demonstration, I think, of how policy needs to be aligned to the agenda. So, customers are going to ask for this more and more going forward. There's a certain group of them that are ready to pay for it today. There'll be more, I think, going forward that will be ready to pay that premium. We've had early discussions with some of our supply chain partners about how do we think about offering customers a lower end-to-end supply chain, when the freight's moving from Europe or Asia into the final destination in North America. I think that's really ambitious. I'm, really excited about it. But for those of you who do business in this area, that, tracking and tracing goods from, the end-to-end supply chain isn't quite where it needs to be, much less being able to, verify and certify the GHG emissions associated with, all of those handoffs. But I think that gives us insight about where things are going.
Yeah, putting a price on carbon is definitely important. And yeah, in terms of standards, in terms of and traceability of credits and so forth, that's another area where work is actually being done. So yeah, still a lot of work to be done. This is a really complex field that's got many components to it. I think we're out of time, but I think the key takeaway here is as Janet and as you've heard throughout this presentation, is collaboration is key. And I think the days of pointing fingers and I guess spin doctoring of what we're doing or may not be doing, but just playing the environmental game, if you will, are over, and it's really a time when we all need to come together because we face this climate challenge together. So government, industry, civil society working together and supporting each other is kind of the theme, I think, underlying all of this, what needs to happen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and hopefully it was a useful event for you, and we hope to hear from you in terms of any comments that you may have. Thank you very much, and good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.